All right, good evening. Thank you all for coming. It's going to be quite an interesting couple of hours because we're going to be basically celebrating the life of somebody who I think is actually the greatest horror writer we have in this country. The American critic S.T. Joshi has said about him, future generations will regard him as the leading horror writer of our generation, every bit the equal of Lovecraft and Blackwood. The Oxford Companion in English Literature has described him as Britain's most respected living horror writer. So please welcome our special guest, my friend and colleague for more than 40 years, the still living legend that is Ramsey Campbell.
May I just say how ominous I found the sight of somebody on the front row with 5 photographs have been laid out in an occult pattern. I just hope you've got no matches that you're going to do something.
Right, we've got a lot to get through tonight. We're going to take a break around about 8 o'clock where you can get some books signed by Ramsey and whatever.
And him,
and me
Steve,
if you want to, but it's about you tonight for a change.
No.
All right, let's kick off with something you and I haven't really ever talked about. You were born in January 1946, which is about 4 months after the end of the Second World War in Liverpool. What are your first memories of growing up in Liverpool in that period of time?
Of Liverpool?
Of Liverpool itself and the city and everything else.
Gosh, well, I can't go back that far.
I mean, not actually when you were born.
No, I remember it. You know, I saw the light and then began to grope forward, and eventually out I came.
And that was tonight at the pub.
That's right. That's right. But apart from that, gee whiz, I honestly don't recall even how old I was when I first ventured out into the big wide world that was Liverpool. You know, because I mean, I remember certainly the garden suburb where I lived, which was, you know, in Wavertree in Liverpool, it was actually a suburb built during the First World War as one of these kind of idyllic projects, basically. You know, it was meant to be
social project.
Yes, yeah. Exactly so. Yeah. I forget. I mean, they actually even had a telegram address, which I now forget. But back then, when they were, you know, inviting people to come and rent a property there, I mean, what I mostly remember about it now, the house itself, is how piddling it was. I mean, you could probably basically fit both floors of the house. Well, Jenny will confirm this or otherwise. into this, you go chop this room in half, and you put the halves on top of each other, or one on top of the other, even more difficult unless you're Escher to do it the other way. And you'd have that house, you know. This room in half. You think I'm being over ambitious?
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Extraordinary place to live. Not least because this is not quite the question you asked, but because my parents were estranged.
What? That's the next question.
You're coming to that.
Yeah.
All right.
We can go on to that.
Basically, you know, they fell out very early indeed in my life.
I mean, you had you've talked openly before about you had a very strange upbringing. Your parents, Nora and Alexander. Mm-hmm. It was an odd situation for any kid, let alone for a kid growing up in the post-war Britain.
Well, yes, I mean, I suppose that was it. But obviously, you think, well, this is how it is. You know, this is what my life is like. In this case, I say there's a tiny house. By the time I was 3 years old, my parents were so much at loggerheads, not least over me, that they didn't speak. They had the occasional fight. And my actual first memory, I think, that I was able to recall years later was them having a struggle at the front door over my father basically having taken me out for a Sunday outing, which apparently he did, you know, that we'd done that for a while, I suppose. And had apparently taken me across the railway track at a local railway station where you weren't meant to do it. As I strongly suspect there were no trains in sight, but even so, you know, he was careless enough to tell my mother this is what he had done, and they had this flaming row about, you know, putting my life at risk. And eventually this progressed as far as the front door, which had little panes of glass in it, and while they struggled on either side of the door to get the last word in, my father being outside, my mother shoved her hands through the pane of glass to Argento-esque effect, you know, so lots of blood and broken glass. And my father then went away, and my mother, interestingly enough, persuaded the neighbours that, in fact, my father had deliberately done this and slammed the door on her hand, which is clearly not the case, which I tried to protest was not the case. But, you know, 3 years old, you know, you're not really going to be listened to. But I still do remember this moment of not being listened to, basically, you know, of saying, well, no, you know, whatever I did say, that's not quite what happened. Not in those words, obviously. Now, it may very possibly have been that the neighbours were rather humouring her, you know, because she had to be taken off to hospital anyway. And that was not quite the last time I saw my father, but it was one of the very last times, because basically the next Sunday, my mother asked, do you want to go out with your father? And I think basically I thought, well, you know, is this sort of thing going to happen again as a result? So I said no, and that was the end of my relationship with my father. But given that it's this tiny, tiny house, we all still lived in it. And for the next, well, something like 20 years,
20 years, yeah.
He was just the presence on the other side of the doors and the footsteps that came upstairs in the night. So he became this increasingly monstrous figure that I never saw. And
you had no contact whatsoever?
Well, virtually none, and so little that you might as well say, but he was certainly negligible. Yeah. And he would occasionally show up, usually for an argument with my mother. He would occasionally leave notes in the house, some to me, written in French for some reason which I never quite understood. Since he was from Glasgow himself. Well, add to this that my mother, really in a sense, at that very moment over the struggle in the, you know, or afterward, the aftermath of the bloody moment at the front door, it became apparent to me that what my mother saw was not necessarily reality. And once I became aware that also she felt that, you know, the Archers, the radio serial, contained coded messages aimed at her. I became aware that, you know, that perhaps more was odd about my mother, or odd was probably not the word I used, but certainly, you know, that again, things that she perceived were not necessarily the reality. So from a very early age indeed, I was actually having to sort out what was perceived from what was real. And I suppose, in a way, I've been writing about it ever since.
I was going to say, I mean, a lot of your stories and novels over the years are about alienation or alienated characters.
Yeah.
Do you think this all comes, I mean,
well,
that Freudian sense?
Some of it, certainly, without question, yes. I mean, it's yes, I mean, that's where the roots are.
And also, your mother wanted to be a writer?
She was a writer.
She was a writer.
She wasn't published to any great extent. You have the occasional story in writers' magazines in the 30s, actually, 40s. But she wrote a whole succession of novels in all manner of genres. I mean, you know, she did, you know, romantic novels, she did detective novels, she did a science fiction novel. I've only very recently discovered a rejection letter from August Derleth.
Wow.
Because
in fact, we
will get to it. Yeah, because we'll get to it. But I mean, basically, because, you know, he published my first book. Yeah. I think she thought, well, and I'm sure I said, you know, well, or she said,
oh, so this was after.
Yeah, so you know, send him, or maybe he just bought my first stuff, you know. So I basically, she said, basically, can I have his address, and or whatever she did say, and she duly sent him this story called The Wish Machine, which is science fantasy, I suppose, rather than science fiction. But he said a polite, but, you know, but a rejection, unfortunately.
Have you read any of your mum's stuff?
Yeah, a lot of it.
And what's your...
Well, I think that basically it was professionally perfectly competent, but it was very much behind its time. It read as if it had been written in the 30s, it seemed to me. So, you know, it would be difficult to find a publisher, I think, even in those days when, you know, a lot more was being published then than now.
So, what was your school life like at this point then? I mean, because you sound like you're the adult in the family.
well, dear me. Well, I went to a succession of Catholic schools to start with. Well, first of all,
you've already got another layer of problems.
Oh, well, we'll get to those in a moment. Bloody hell, yeah. In the first instance, it was a simple Catholic school, Christ the King, in Liverpool. I went 5 to 7 years old, which was run by a maniac called Mr. Meldrum, who had to knock kids about at the playground while the parents were watching through the railings. With those days. I mean, you know, in all conscience, things have gone too far in the other direction now, but, you know, I think these days the parents would come in and basically nut him one, and quite fucking right too. But it didn't happen in those days. You know, the teaching stuff was sort of paramount, you know. Yeah. They were untouchable. But partly, I think, because of that environment, my mother then took me away from there. I was apparently having nightmares for all sorts of reasons, some of which you can probably imagine. And so I went to a private school, which was not specifically Catholic. It was, in fact, there was a sort of little class for Catholics, so it was largely Protestant, in fact. And so we had a little, the teaching.
Enclave.
Yeah, the Catholic enclave. That's right. There were quite a few of us, I think. In fact, there is if you want to look it up, there's a Facebook group called the Rye Bank. It was called, the school Rye Bank, rye as in rye, as in rye bread, Rye Bank, and you can find reminiscences of people being beaten at the school by all sorts of ex-pupils. I don't remember this happening to me particularly, so that was till I was 11. I do remember, and I'm just thinking aloud now. I remember we had one class where a pastor of some sort came in and questioned us on theological matters or tried to get our minds going. And I remember impressing him actually, because he said something like, why must God have been the first creator? And I stuck my hand up and said, well, because otherwise somebody would have had to create him, which apparently impressed him. So it was very metaphysical of me at 8 years old, or however it was, I don't know, 11 years old, I then went, God help me, to a Christian Brothers grammar school. That's a memorable experience, believe me. And to be fair, some of the masters were superb. There was one guy, the last English teacher I had, a chap called Ray Thomas, who was splendid. I mean, most of us maybe have that one teacher who was the inspiring.
I had one.
Yeah, and in my case it was Ray Thomas, who was extraordinary. I mean, just communicated his enthusiasm for prose and literature like nobody. But there were also several people, at the school you wouldn't put in charge of a dog's home, never mind adolescent boys, and would now be prosecuted for abuse, in fact.
Do you look back on those days with a fondness or with horror? I mean,
bit of both, really.
Yeah.
Bit of both. In a sense, they were, not really formative, but nothing is wasted, for the writer. So certainly bits of those pop up in stuff that I've written. I mean, there's an old terrible story of mine called The Interloper, early story of mine. It's in Demons by Daylight. But fundamentally, the description at the beginning of that of a class at a school is just straightforward reportage. That's what it was like. It wasn't always like that. That's some of what it was like, at its worst.
Now, although your mother was obviously suffering from schizophrenia and whatever,
yeah, undiagnosed,
but she was very supportive of you.
Certainly was, yes.
And
yes.
So, I mean, explain a little bit about how she did that with you.
Well, really, she encouraged me to write, basically, as simple as that, from a very early age. Now, I have to say, I think part of the thing was that she regarded her writing and, to some extent mine as well, as a possible way of getting out of her marriage, because another problem was, since she was a Catholic, you couldn't actually get a divorce in the 50s, as I understand. You get a separation, but even that was hugely difficult because you had to prove it. Nothing like now, where you could have a sort of mutual thing. And my father didn't want to get this separation, apparently.
Which is why they can't stay married all that time.
Yeah, that's right, that's right. But no, I mean, basically, as I say, from earlier, very early on, she was encouraging me to write. And, well, I mean, 11 years old was when I actually really seriously started going at it in the sense of completing short stories. And I actually did a whole book of them, all of which are quite terrible. We're going to get to that. All right, fair enough. So well, in that case, let me say that she encouraged me to send that one out, which is the first completed book I did, which was, let me tell you, written in longhand and illustrated in crayon
by
the author. Yeah. And this was the copy I sent out to publishers. God knows what they made of it,
It was the 50s, it was post-war.
Well, yes.
They weren't used to good stuff.
Well, thank God for that, but they still sent it back though. Mind you, given that The Young Visitors was published, it is in that sort of vein, you could say, certainly.
If you were already writing short stories by the time you were 11, or even earlier, so when did you start discovering the weird fiction stuff in Liverpool? I mean, obviously Liverpool's a dock, and lots of boats come in, so lots of magazines and American type stuff would come in.
I didn't get to that.
I know you also say that it was actually not Weird Tales or anything. It was Phantom, the British version of Weird
Oh
Tales.
no, it was even earlier than that.
Even
it was
that,
significant. Oh gosh, it's significant. No, it was 6
Were
years.
there books in the house then?
No, the books in the library.
In the library.
There were books in the house, but it was the library specifically. There was an amazing little place. It was a Chilwell Library in Liverpool. Again, it was just housed in a shop premises, which again was about the length of this room and half the width, And there were bookcases on either wall, and there was a two-sided bookcase down the middle, and books on the back wall as well. And they actually would bring in lots of books from other branches as well. Now, my mother, to be fair, was, remarkably enlightened in some ways, you may think, because she let me use her ticket, or tickets, in the library to borrow stuff. So, and the first book I ever remember borrowing, and so the first adult book I remember getting, was a book called 50 Years of Ghost Stories. And I was 6. It sounds extraordinary, but I actually read Edith Wharton's Afterward in that book, and was haunted by it. I certainly got it, So Edith Wharton being not that much less demanding than Henry James. One assumes I was hideously precocious, which I was actually. I'm not proud.
You still are.
Not proud. Well, no senility setting in by now. But no, I was. It's not something to boast about. It's just a fact, Interesting enough, though, the turn of the screw was in that book, but I wasn't allowed to read it because it was not quite nice. So that was the one I couldn't.
This is by your
read.
mother.
That's right. She obviously spotted it was in there, but Edith Wharton was all right, which indeed she was.
Yeah.
Now, oddly enough, what really haunted me about that book was one story, and I didn't particularly at this stage identify writers as such. It was just the story. So, and I think I might say that book was probably from another branch. So, when I wanted to read it again, went back again, it was gone, so I had to order it in. This was probably a couple of years later. The thing about the story was this, the one that particularly, not really stuck in my mind. Basically, I lay in bed at night wishing I hadn't read it for weeks. And then, and this is what I think distinguishes us and everybody in this room, I'm sure, from we aficionados, from folk who say, well, I don't like horror, basically. We're the people who, having been terrified by it, then want to go and do it again, or either want to relive that experience or something similar. So, this story, having the one I'm about to tell you about, the one that terrified me so much, I then wanted to go back and read it again, which I duly did. There were 2 images in the story, one of which was of somebody going through a chest of drawers, linen in the drawers, and eventually gets to the bottom drawer, and a little pink hand comes groping out. And in the same story later on, somebody going into a room in the dark, and something like a huge insect groping with feelers over his face. Now, in fact, it's M.R. James, it's the resident at Whitminster. I didn't know that. I'd not identified James at this point, but it's interesting that of all that I'd read at that point, it was James that got to me on that visceral level. Yeah. Now, that said, also and my mother read most of them actually as well. Also lots of science fiction anthologies. So I think probably about a year later, so I was 7-ish, Groff Conklin's Strange Travels in Science Fiction, which contained The Colour Out of Space, which may very possibly have been the first Lovecraft story I ever read. There might have been a couple of other minor, there were Derleth anthologies in the library as well. But I remember the thing about The Colour Out of Space, I remember feeling it was sort of transgressive. I genuinely remember...
Even at that age?
Yeah, I remember reading it and thinking, my mother wouldn't like me reading this. And I actually remember sort of going through it and almost think I better get through this before she sees I'm reading it, I want to finish it before she said, you can't read that, and because it's a very understated story in some ways, for all the absurd notions of how Lovecraft writes, when you actually look, it's nothing very much like that at all. There's restraint, but the leaning on the unspeakable and indescribable is hugely exaggerated both by his detractors and by his admirers, actually, some of them anyway. And in fact, there are moments in The Colour Out of Space that are very understated, but they're there. They're just like M.R. James. Yes. He shows just enough to suggest much more. So when somebody picks up, when the narrator within the story of Colour Out of Space picks up a stick, and after that the the person in the attic no longer moves or speaks. I knew perfectly well what he was getting at, you know. So he didn't have to tell me, and so I was getting all that. But that was part of what struck me as being, you know, going almost too far, you know.
Do you think that's because Lovecraft was writing for an American market, and the other people you're reading were the slightly more classical English writers? It's different. Were you already aware that it was a different kind of horror?
No, I don't think so. No, because after all, and you know, Kim is the first to point this out. You know, the M.R. James, there's quite a lot of actual gruesome.
Violent writer.
Absolutely, there's a lot of violence in there. It's not particularly leaned upon, but it's certainly there. By gum, you know, people get their faces sucked off, and in Count Magnus, for instance, and all that. So, you know, somebody with their jaws broken with stones and a warning to the curious. Which, in fact, funny enough, was the other story in 50 Years of Ghost Stories that I read. So, I mean, I was getting all this. Ray Bradbury, I remember both of us fell in love with Bradbury's work.
Everybody does.
Yeah, well, indeed. It was. I mean, I was about 7 or 8, you know, and we were getting The Illustrated Man and Fahrenheit 451, the Silver Locusts, and so forth. So, you know, we were really getting. And the other thing about this, of course, was that in those days, well, perhaps a couple of years went by because I think about when I was 11 or 12 or so, I realised I'd read everything that was available.
In the library?
Not in the library,
no,
everywhere. You know, unless
your area.
Well, obviously not everywhere. I mean, in terms of the genre, specifically horror fiction and supernatural horror. But you know that everything that had been, almost everything had been published, except the stuff that was very hard to collect, obviously. And at that stage, that included Lovecraft. You couldn't find Lovecraft in any quantity up until the early 60s in Britain. But eventually, you know, all the classics, in particular, I'd bought and read. In fact, this is a weird thing. I had a compulsion. Whenever I bought a new book, a new anthology, let's say, if let's say there was the 83rd reprint of The Fall of the House of Usher, I still had to read it again. So, you know, I read everything that was in the book, even if I'd read it already.
Because that was like a collector's thing.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah. Well, of course, it meant that I got more and more familiar with the text.
How easy was it to come, I mean, in bookstores and things, how easy in the 50s, let's say, was it to find that kind of stuff? Because obviously the paperback boom had started in the 40s in America. Yeah. It hadn't really quite come to England.
No, Pan Books were doing some. I mean, we hadn't quite got onto the Pan Books of
horror.
Get
to that as well,
we will get to that later. But no, they were doing the M.R. James first two books, you know, Ghost Stories and Antiquary. They were doing Cynthia Asquith's ghost books, which are highly underrated anthology in my view. Lots of horror in there, actually. You know.
Oh, yeah.
Again,
when Churchyard Yawn and stuff like that. Yeah,
well, indeed, of course, Ringing the Changes, the Aikman, first appearance of that. But no, it was. It's interesting. Again, you see, it was my mother to some extent. Hardcovers were absolutely respectable. You know, you get them out of the library, that's okay. Paperbacks were reasonably respectable. So you get those. Pulp magazines, no, you can't have them. I didn't really spot that half of the books at the library were reprinting from the pulps, but that's by the way. But it wasn't until I was 10, actually, I was allowed, there was a kind of softening of attitude, or probably I was now old enough to cope with the stuff in her view. So that was when I began to buy magazines. Initially, Astounding Science Fiction, I remember, you know, this sort of liberating moment where I bought the April 1956 issue of Astounding Science Fiction. I think it was 1 and 6, might even half a crown. By gum, that was expensive.
1 and 6.
It was probably 1 and 6, wasn't it? Yeah. It had a story in it. It only very recently became apparent to me, called The Short Life, by someone I'd never heard of. And still haven't heard of it. Actually, it's Aldous Woodruff under a pseudonym.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Francis somebody, I forget.
How easy was it to find those kind of pulp magazines? Because again, as I say, Liverpool was a dot.
Pretty well. These were not the actual imports.
These were the British reprints.
These were the Thorpe and Porter reprints. But what did happen, and you know, as luck would have it, when I just about turned 10 years old, that Thorpe and Porter were unloading. They were remaindering lots of their digests with a sixpenny kind of stamp on them. So the last few issues of Weird Tales, the original magazine, Weird Tales, all the digests, you could buy those in cardboard boxes on the counter in these strange, well, you know, they don't exist anymore.
Newsagent corner
stores. Well, sort of, corner shops, general stores. So, you know, they sold cigarettes and cans of Heinz beans and magazines and all this strange no really exists today. But so, of course, I would go and raid these for my pocket money and get several since they were sixpence each. And so the first ones I grabbed were Weird Tales. But I suppose I should really go back to that. I know you know this anecdote, Steve, but I suppose I just for fun, because although, 10 years old I got to buy these, 7 years old I believe it was, that my yen became apparent. Because we were in Southport, near Liverpool, seaside resort. I still remember this pretty vividly. On the side streets going down between the promenade and the main street, which is an extraordinary sort of Victorian arcade street, full of metal awnings and stuff. And there was one of these little general stores which had magazines in the window. And here was an issue of Weird Tales. I'd never seen this before. And on the cover, as it seemed to me, there was this image of, what should we say, in the foreground, a sort of bird-like creature, though not a bird, I thought, and behind a kind of black desert, across which these two monstrous figures, which consisted basically of huge skulls and rudimentary bodies, were kind of scuttling toward this panicked creature. And I remember thinking approximately, if that's what the cover looks like, what wonders must be within, And
this is how they're selling it.
Well, absolutely, So basically, I said, I want. Well, I don't know what I said exactly, but basically it was, I want that, and you're 7, you can't have that. So, and it stayed in my mind for years and years. Interestingly, I still remember the famous colophon of Weird Tales, the unforgettable with the W, all that stuff. So that when these digests came my way, they were the first that I grabbed. But I couldn't find this specific issue of Weird Tales, which is actually one of the pulps. It was a British reprint, if I'm sure. And it was only, I was about 16. I eventually tracked the thing down, and it's an early 52 issue. And what's actually on the cover is a vulture. It's not very well painted, but it's a vulture sitting on some human bones. And in the background, a couple of skeletons, which may possibly be ambulatory, but, it's difficult to know, really, because the painting's not that precise. So that's what was really there.
But in your imagination...
Exactly. The thing, but in a sense, it seems to me that, what I saw that, and immediately my imagination wanted something weirder.
Extrapolated.
And so, I kind of created that immediately. And it seems like I've been doing that ever since.
So, Ghostly Tales, 16 stories and a poem.
Yes indeed. Good Lord.
I mean, you were 11 years old.
11
How precocious is that?
Well, I'll tell you, it contains the line, and it sums up the book. The door banged open, and the aforementioned skeleton rushed in. I rest my case.
Now, obviously, you were already fired up, ready to go, have your first book out at the age of 11.
Well, not out. But
well, no, but trying.
Hardly out. Well, written, yeah.
So, did your mum help you try and send that out to publishers?
I'm sure she did. She said yes. I'm sure. I mean, I think she got the writers and artists.
And you obviously thought that illustrating it yourself in crayon would help sell it, because that was a great bonus.
I'm not absolutely sure that I had in mind when I did it the idea of sending it out. I think my mother, once it was completed, I think she encouraged me to finish it. And it was only then she said, now you must send it to publishers, most of whom...
Which is pretty interesting. Rather than just say, it's a nice hobby, dear, go and work in a factory or something.
Yeah.
She's actually thinking...
Oh, yes. She is, indeed. Yeah. But as I say, I think she may have had the idea that, if
it's a way of getting out.
Sell the book, and we could get some money, But yes, I mean, it went to Collins, who put it to the children's department. I remember, lady who said it made me feel quite shivery sitting here at my desk. Well,
it's a good quote. Made me feel quite shivery.
Absolutely.
Sitting on the back.
But now the extraordinary one was Tom Boardman Jr., who was one of the very first. I mean, Boardman's may even have been the first major British hardcover publisher to do American science fiction novels.
They did Robbie Howard in this country for the first.
Oh, really?
So they actually Boardman published Robbie Howard before anybody. They published a Conan book in this country before the Americans.
That I didn't know. Yeah. No, right. So that might have been Tom Boardman Sr.
Yes, that would have been Tom Boardman Sr.
Right.
Yeah.
So Tom Boardman Jr., who, interesting enough, was a guest of honour at an Eastercon in the early 1960s.
Wow, fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I think Brian
Aldis
brought him in, I think, or Kingsley Amis, or some of those guys.
Some name dropping going on.
Well,
okay.
but they were all involved in, because I think he was a friend of theirs, and maybe published them.
Yeah, probably was.
But the thing was, he sent me a rejection letter. But the rejection letter basically said, we can't do this because we don't publish ghost stories. But he said, given the start you've made, we think there's every possibility you might make the grade if you carry on doing it.
That's fantastic.
Pretty strong stuff,
really
you'd say.
Yeah. And how can you remember the feeling when you got that one? Or
pretty good, yeah, for certain. Yeah.
So Ghostly Tales never sold, obviously, and then eventually, 30 years later, I think it came out.
For collectors only.
For collectors only.
For the
Although I'm sure one day PS will do a hardcover, limited signed,
God forbid. God forbid.
Or whatever. Yeah. But one of the things that interests me is that I also grew up a little bit later than you in the 1960s in England. And I can remember the things, you weren't allowed to send money overseas, postage was very difficult.
Oh,
how the hell did you get in contact with August Derleth in those days? And also, how did you even know about August? You said the library books.
Yeah.
Did you just copy the address out the front of an envelope?
No, it was a lot more complicated than that. What happened was this. We should really explain that I'd done these stories for a start, right? But I mean, between Ghostly Tales and that, I suppose, very briefly, just sketch it in. I was sort of floundering around, I think, trying to find a model on which to base what I wrote. So I mean, oddly enough, the one in Ghostly Tales, most of it is just bits of favourite stories stuck together without God knows.
I mean, they're kind of like stories you would tell at school, in the playground,
with
friends. And
that's
like
right.
That. They're like retellings of urban myth type stories.
That sort of thing, and bits of, as you say, Phantom magazine, which was, a short-lived British equivalent
magazine.
Of Weird Tales. That's right.
With Edith Wharton.
Well, yeah.
Still.
But I mean, the longest story in Ghostly Tales, all of 4,000 words, I'll have was fundamentally a sort of Reader's Digest version of The Devil Rides Out. So, in a sense, I'd found a focus. That it is, that story is a bit more focused. Then I had to go doing Arthur Machen and didn't finish that. Then I had to go doing John Dixon Carr, the very fine detective writer who derives from Chesterton, specialised in locked room and impossible mysteries. But particularly had a great sense of the macabre. Clearly influenced by M.R. James in some ways for atmosphere. And interestingly enough, I tried writing a novel along his lines called Murder by Moonlight. Did about 50 pages, abandoned it. And then I think probably about the next year, had another shot, but I didn't kind of try and salvage bits of the first draft. I started all over again, using fundamentally the same material. So even then I was kind of enjoying rewriting.
And you would have been what age at this point?
I'd be 13 about 13, maybe 14. Okay. Maybe I can't get this chronology quite right, unfortunately, because what is clear, because I've been rereading this thing very recently, was that at some point during it, I think, I discovered Lovecraft in quantity, which is to say the very first British...
With Cry Horror.
Very first British paperback of Lovecraft. Up to 1960, you could not find any book by Lovecraft in Britain in paperback. Well, so none was published in Britain, And I got Cry Horror, read it in a single day, and was completely overwhelmed by it. And
it's basically a best. For everybody who doesn't know it, it's basically a best of Lovecraft that was done in America. And
Don Wollheim
and Don Wollheim was a friend of ours. Edited it, and it was basically half of The Outsider and Others.
Yeah, that's really
it was. But if you were a Lovecraft guy, it was the best thing you could ever find.
Yeah, damn right.
And it influenced a lot of people besides Ramsey as well.
Yeah, that's right. So in fact, you can see some way into this detective story book that I'd read Lovecraft, and the words like eldritch began to creep in, for instance. But at some, I generally cannot. Suddenly, I can't remember the exact chronology. I think that probably at some stage during writing that, I thought, no, what I really want to do is just pure supernatural horror in the manner of Lovecraft. So I began to
more so than James and Machen and all the rest of those guys.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually found a focus finally and a model on which I wanted to base what I was doing. So I was 14, and I began to write Lovecraftian short stories. And I wrote 3, 4, 5 of them, I think, longhand. Now, by this time, I was a member of the British Science Fiction Association, and I was borrowing old issues of Weird Tales from the library. Peter Maybe, who was then the librarian, still with us actually, still shows up at Easter cons, he noticed that I and a chap called Pat Kearney were the only two people borrowing Weird Tales from the library. It's the postal library.
Yeah, it's like a fan line.
Yeah.
So they would hold all these magazines and you could take them out and mail them back.
That's right, that's right. So he put us in touch with each other.
Right.
Pat and I duly corresponded and got on very well. I told Pat about these stories that I'd done. So he said he would like to read them. And even then I was, astonishing naivety. I sent the only handwritten. I've not typed them out yet. I just sent the only handwritten copy off to him in the mail. If it had vanished, well, it would have gone. But no, he read it, sent it back, and asked whether he could publish one in his fanzine called Gaudi. And he duly published The Tower from Yuggoth, in fact, one of the very first stories of this sort that I wrote, illustrated by Eddie Jones.
Yeah.
2 illustrations. Yeah. And this came out, and at this point, I think, it was one of his readers, a lady called Betty Kujawa, who was an American fan, said, well, look, you ought to show these to August Derleth. He publishes Lovecraft, he runs Arkham House, maybe he'd like to see them.
And of course, if anybody doesn't know, Derleth actually knew Lovecraft, corresponded with him, and that kind of thing. So, technically, we're now we're one step away from Lovecraft.
Oh, yeah.
Which is, you can't imagine now.
No. And indeed, Derleth and Wandrai, Don Wandrai, created Arkham House in order, initially, just to publish Lovecraft in hardcover as a memorial volume, The Outsider and Others. So, it might have been Betty who got the Arkham House address, actually, because she was in America. It was not difficult to find. It was very simple. It was Place of Hawks, Sauk City, Wisconsin, whatever the zip code. Did they even have a zip code of those?
They would have had smaller zip codes.
Yeah, or something like that. Anyway, so I sent Derleth. Well, no, I didn't even do that. I wrote to Derleth saying. And the letter is still extant because now PS Publishing, the saintly Peter and Nicky Crowther of PS Publishing, they did do all the correspondence between me
everything.
And Derleth.
How many people keep?
I didn't. No, ST Joshi tracked all this stuff down.
From where? From Place of Hawks?
Yes, Derleth had.
But even Ghostly Tales. I mean, you still had.
I've still got the thing. No, I've got the original copy of that. Yeah. With all the crayon.
Why did you keep all this stuff?
Because I'm mad.
Or did you think one day I'll be famous and people will want to read all this?
Oh God, no. Well, I wish I'd done more of that, you see, because no, seriously, when I moved house, when Jenny and I bought our first house, I think, this is getting off the point, this is a parenthesis.
This is why we're talking.
But no, I mean, when I lived with my parents, I had a whole kind of chest of drawers full of correspondence with Kirby McCauley and Robert Aikman, J. Vernon Shea, and that got lost in transit. So all those letters went, and including I've still got the Derleth letters for some reason. Those I still do have, actually. But in fact, it was S.T. Joshi who edited the book of our correspondence, mine and Derleth, who went to Place of Hawks, as you say, and found the original, I think, or carbons, because Derleth kept all the carbons of his correspondence.
People did in those days.
Yeah,
did,
that's right. So that's right.
You write off.
Okay, so that's right. So I write to Derleth, basically just saying, and you can find the letter in this book, but approximately what I said was, I wasn't by any means saying, would you like to publish this? All I was saying was, fundamentally, do you think these are any good? Because you're the man to know, because you've published Lovecraft, you're the authority. And he wrote back saying, well, basically, no, it was perfectly polite, but he wrote back saying, before you think of publishing these, we must see them because
not reasonably.
I know it's a controversial issue, but he maintained that they held the copyright for Lovecraft and Lovecraft's ideas and Lovecraft's mythos. So they had to have the say on whether anything based on that was published. So and in fact, he said, although your writing is obviously, I didn't know, it must have been a handwritten airmail, one of those aerograms that you had
so the
in
blue
those
things that folded out into 3 sections.
That's right. That's right.
And you lick them and stuck them around the outside.
That's right.
Insane.
Yes,
Didn't think we would get anything.
No, but the thinnest thing.
And they're like on tissue paper, rice paper.
That's right.
It's crazy.
Yes, you could eat them probably for all I know. I don't know. So anyway, I'd obviously handwritten my first letter to him. So he said, even though your handwriting seems perfectly legible, I'd prefer you to type. So I duly typed.
Did you have a typewriter in those days?
Well, my mother did, so I borrowed her typewriter and duly sent these things off. And this would have been, oh gosh, late 1960. So I'm 14 now.
Yeah, you're 14.
And some little time passed, and Derleth then...
What time would pass? Because you have to go on a boat or a plane, then people have to look at it, and then...
Good question.
So
now,
all things take...
Well, I'm just wondering, would that have been airmail? Probably not, actually. The actual package full of manuscripts.
Yeah.
Maybe that went sea mail.
Yeah,
so that'd be...
It could take 8 weeks.
Oh gosh, it could. It did.
Yeah,
often.
and then you'd have to read or whatever. So
right.
you'd be like sitting there going...
Yeah. Well, no, to be honest, I wasn't that concerned.
You really weren't.
Well, no, I just thought, well, if you like, I just wanted to know if you liked
And these were the original stories again, you had no copies? You had no
no, I typed them now. So theoretically I had the handwritten draft.
You had the holographs.
Yeah, which are now in...
Because again, there were no such things as Xerox machines.
No,
you couldn't photocopy things.
The Gestetners weren't there.
Well, that would be an interesting experience.
God. That's how fanzines were done. You had to type your thing
onto a piece of paper, and he actually made holes.
That's right.
And then printed ink through them.
That's right. Yes,
that's how first fanzines were done.
That's right. That's
how old we are.
Yes, absolutely. No, Mum and I never published one. Did you?
Oh yeah.
No,
I actually drew on when I was doing early fanzines at my school. I had to draw my illustrations straight on.
Yeah.
No paper. You had to draw it onto the thing they put through the rollers.
Yeah.
And then before that, they had monks with big pens who just
yes,
did it
that's
for
right.
you. Go on.
Yes. Okay. So, I got a letter back from Derleth saying, basically saying this book needs a lot of work, and you need to do editing of all sorts. But I do think you may have a potential Arkham House book.
Did you reveal to him that you were 14 years old?
Not at this point.
No. I think that's fascinating.
Well, there's no reason.
He had no idea who he was going back to at that point. And I adored Derleth. For me, as an editor of books for 40 years, Derleth, I know everybody says Lovecraft, blah, blah, blah. For me, Derleth is the person who I always looked up to. I think he's an okay writer. He's not a great writer, but as an editor and a publisher, I think he had no match in those days. And the fact that he just responded to this, I had no idea who this guy was in England.
Yes,
but in a proper way. Not putting you down,
Not a bit, no. Mind you, he did, quite rightly
too. He was quite critical.
Certainly quite a stern letter with details of what ought to be. How I should rewrite these stories.
Which is what you want at that point.
Oh, bloody right. So I was extremely lucky in getting an editor at that stage of the game. And I will, if you like, there may be some people here who have heard me do this, but I will, if you would like me to do so, just enact a paragraph which he felt needed editing.
I think people would love to see that.
I think Paul knows this one, don't you? I think you know this.
I think people would love to see it.
Which is why he's about to run out of the room. Derleth did say that there's an early story of mine called The Tomb Heard, which actually then became The Church in High Street because he didn't like that title, Church in High Street. And in the original draft, it contained a telegram. And I've done this so often, I can actually do it pretty well word for word. So I will give you the paragraph, and it goes like this, which Derleth said, you need to rewrite this. And it says, now followed the passage that disturbed me more than anything else. My friend had clearly been composing a telegram, and it goes, to Richard Dexter, come at once to Kingsport, because I was then using Lovecraft territory. Come at once to Kingsport. Now remember, this is a telegram. You are needed by me here as aid against agencies which may kill me, or worse, if you do not come immediately. Will explain as soon as you get here. But what is this thing that flops unspeakably down the corridor towards this room? It cannot be that abomination that I glimpsed in the nitrous vault beneath the cursed church in Asquith Place. Here, Yog, Sosos, Cthulhu Fatan!
And then the guy hands that to the post office guy.
Dot.
He said, now will you transcribe that as a telegram, please?
I mean, what the post office would have made of this is not recorded.
It's like, could you wait for a moment while I just hand this over and get it sent, and then we take it from there. I have a question about that story as well.
Yes.
I'm actually on the list. So why is it called the church in High Street, not the church in the High Street?
I think it might have been the High Street originally, but I think you probably...
It's a typo in the book, or...
I think was it not called High Street, though, in the actual street? So maybe you... It's difficult. It's an arguable point, isn't it? You know? I mean, I used to say the Tottenham Court Road, you see. But you're not supposed to say that.
No,
Tottenham Court
just
Road. That's what same principle. Okay. Same principle.
Right. It's called High Street.
Yeah.
So, you were... I mean, the great thing about this was you took his advice, which is...
God knows it was necessary. Not least, you see, to take the whole thing out of Lovecraft's New England,
which is that was a copyright thing, though, wasn't it? Because I thought they felt they controlled some of that, and then the idea of you putting it into your own milieu, British thing, which I think was a quite brilliant idea. At the time.
I don't. He didn't specifically say it was because of the copyright. It was more that it would establish it as having more, of a distinct personality if I were to use a British setting instead.
It's a brilliant editorial note.
Absolutely. I mean, this said, of course, sadly, that he then suggested the Severn Valley, which I jumped at. At this point, I'd just grab everything that was suggested. Because he said that decadent Roman practices could then be referred to, which is fine. Well, had I thought of that, for God's sake?
You're 14 years old. How much were you into decadent Roman practices?
Well, I've been so for years. My God. But no, I could have used Chester, which is a lot closer to home. Could have gone and looked at it more. Whereas the Severn Valley, I'd never been there. Now, it was apparent in my first draft that I'd never been to New England, to put it mildly. I'd been further than Southport. But equally, I'd not been to the Severn Valley. So, gently rolling Cotswold Hills, there aren't, believe me, because I've got up one, but not until years later. But because, Derleth was American, he didn't really spot that my Severn Valley was really no more realistic than my New England.
Derleth's London for Solar Ponds wasn't that realistic either.
That's true, yeah.
So, I mean, basically, at the end of the day, to cut a long story short, you rewrote to his instructions pretty much. Yeah. And when you're 18 years old, you have your first book out.
From Arkham House, The Inhabitant of the Lake, and what should have been...
I tell you, and what was your title? What was his title?
Well, it was actually... it wasn't... To be fair to Derleth, it wasn't his title. Originally, it was supposed to be The Inhabitant of the Lake and Other Unwelcome Tenants. In fact, he'd originally suggested possibly just Unwelcome Tenants. Or, it's good,
James,
or, The Inhabitant of the Lake and Other, No. But the thing was that when he sent it to Frank Utpatel, who was the cover artist, he misnamed it with, Less Welcome Tenants, because it was his own book had been, Mr. George and Less Pleasant Persons, which had come out very shortly before, so that had just stuck in his mind. And by the time we spotted the mistake, they'd already printed the cover. So obviously we just had to leave it. But that said, the PS edition that came out quite recently, which also has all the first drafts in it, we did eventually finally get to the original title.
So how was it when I guess a package of hardcover books turned up from America?
They did, yeah.
You're 18 years old. Your mum's still around to see it, which is great.
Oh yeah, very much so.
What was your reaction in the Campbell house?
Phenomenal. Although that said, of course, I'd already had one Arkham House appearance because Dark House, he wanted to use a storyman as a kind of promotional device for this book that was coming soon. And so
it's like training you.
Yeah, exactly. But so, I mean, in a way, even better, I got Dark Mind, Dark Heart. And here I'm at 16 years old alongside Bob Bloch, Robert Bloch for God's sake, and H. Russell Wakefield and William Hope Hodgson, which is pretty strong stuff, believe me, So that was phenomenal, but still, obviously, so was having a book to my name, for sure.
Did you take it to school and show your friends, or?
Well, I'd left school by then.
By 16?
No. Oh, I beg your pardon. No, I'd even left school by the time Dark Mind came out.
Okay,
yeah, I'd just about. Yeah. So I started working in the
tax office.
In the tax office, by gum, yes.
How did that happen?
It was basically, to some extent, it was Derleth again. He just said, don't try and depend on, writing to make a living, because clearly, in a sense, he was thinking of himself.
Lovecraft and a lot of other people.
In terms of, well, no, so much it does. He had to write far too much. He admitted this. In fact, I remember one of his letters that said, good God, it said this was, I forget, in the 60s somewhere, that he'd had a hospital appointment and they'd cancelled it. So, he had a day free, so he wrote a novella. Pretty good going, I'd say.
Yeah, pretty good, yeah.
Yeah.
So you get the book out,
yeah.
It's there. You're not earning a huge amount of money. I'm sure it didn't make any difference to your lifestyle in any shape or form.
Oh, no, it was, good God, no, I think it was $100 actually, was the advance.
Well, it'd be quite a lot of money in those days.
Well, it was more
Buy
than...
a house or something,
more no, you get a trip to Paris, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Your work, you've got a full-time job.
Yes.
It seems to me that at that point you'd got Lovecraft out of your system pretty much.
Oh, not quite there. I suppose well, it depends. In a sense, I was already, even in The Inhabitant of the Lake, I was kind of working toward doing different things. I mean, when I look back at it now, I've looked over it pretty well for the PS edition. The first few stories, I'm sure it was unconscious of me, but it was instinctive actually. I tend to write instinctively, even back then, certainly now. That I was trying out various Lovecraftian modes, and it's worth just remembering that, because again, this parody notion of Lovecraft as being the guy with only one style, and that's not a very good one, which is utter rubbish. I mean, what actually is true of Lovecraft is he tried out every mode he possibly could that he could try himself. And the modulation of prose and the difference of the prose in different stories is very marked indeed. So in my book, I was having to go at the sort of florid, outsider, lurking fear sort of a style, but also the sort of documentary style of stuff like, say, the Dunwich Horror, and I suppose a rather more sort of pulpy and discursive style in some of the other stories. But, about halfway through, I'm using a hell of a lot more dialogue than Lovecraft did. And oddly enough, I do remember this, the stuff I've been writing previously, before I was doing my Lovecraft stuff, there was lots of dialogue. It wasn't very good, but, I was writing a whole lot of dialogue. When I found Lovecraft as a template, if you like, I obviously just thought, well, he doesn't write dialogue, so I can't write dialogue either. You don't do dialogue in this kind of fiction, which was obviously a mistake, because you clearly can. But about halfway through The Inhabitant, of the stories in that first book of mine, it becomes apparent, that lots more dialogue becomes, and there are a couple of stories told very largely through it, So I was already trying out different modes, but it was still, the foundation was Lovecraft, though, I think.
And that's basically, and that one book is essentially the foundation for your entire career, in many respects. And you've gone back in different ways. One of the things you put into that book was the Revelations of Glaki.
Yeah.
How do you pronounce it? Glaki.
Well, it is now, you see. Well,
you put this little
it was
thing
Jenny.
in it.
It was Jenny, you see. Jenny was here in the front row and also down the screen. It was my greatest inspiration, without whom I would not be here today.
But that's your version of the Necronomicon.
Well, that's right. But it was at John and Kate's wedding, just before it, John and Kate Probert, and you somehow you heard a voice from the ether told you that it should be pronounced Glaki, did it not? In some
that's
way.
why the apostrophe now comes in.
That's right, yes, right. Indeed so.
But I mean, you created your own...
I might have been coughing.
Lucky.
Fair enough.
One of those things. And so you created your own book of horror as well.
Yes.
And you've come, and even now you're still using that stuff 40?
Well, largely because I felt I didn't get it right the first time. You see, that's the problem. I actually look back at all these ideas, which some decent ideas that I just didn't get right, it seems to me. So I've gone back and had another go, and I mean the worst of them, not the worst of the ideas by any means. I mean, one of the things I did with that first book was use some of Lovecraft's unused ideas with Derleth's permission from the Commonplace book. Yeah. Lovecraft kept a notebook.
And a lot of people have done that over the
years.
Yeah,
indeed. Of some of the story ideas that he himself used, and lots that he never got round to using. And almost the last of them was apparently a dream he had. It's a wonderful idea of being in a forest, I think outside Providence, and meeting a swarm of insects which flew into him in some ways, and immediately he experienced their memories of these alien landscapes and other worlds. A tremendous idea, which I screwed up absolutely in a story called The Insects from Shigei. And I was so ashamed of what I'd done, when I look back at it, that I actually put it into, it was actually The Darkest Part of the Woods, which is a novel of mine that's pretty well founded on the case of Charles Dexter Ward in a way. It's in a sense it doesn't use many of those references, but the occult is there, but it's not specifically Lovecraftian, but without Lovecraft it would not exist.
Good. And so at this point now, we're going to actually take a break in a second, guys, so we can go for a loo.
Yes.
Ramsey can sign some books. There's still some books left over there. And then we'll get back on track. Uh-huh. So at this point...
You mean we're on track now?
Yeah, we're on track. We're doing fine. So you've now reached this point where you've got a full-time job in the tax office.
Mm-hmm.
Not a tax inspector. You were a tax...
No, never a tax inspector.
No, you were a tax...
I was a tax ferret. No, I was just a guy who... I was one of the clerical officers. That's what I was. For 4 years, yeah.
And your dream was still to be a writer?
Oh, yeah. Well... I was certainly not dreaming of being a full-time writer. No, I was pretty happy just doing what I did, and seeing the occasional story into print. I mean, what is kind of important, I suppose, is that let me see. So how old was I now? I was 19. This would have been 1965, right? So I'm still in the tax office. The Inhabitant has come out. So a year later, I wrote what I think is my first kind of thoroughly personal story, which is a story called The Cellars.
Yes.
And the crucial thing, well, there are many crucial things about that. It's not very good, but I mean, that's by the way. What's crucial about that is that I finally moved away from using this invented Severn Valley setting, which is increasingly like Liverpool anyway. And finally, The Cellars is set in Liverpool very, very thoroughly, very, very in great detail. And in fact, a lot of the description there is Liverpool as it precisely was then.
Contemporary story,
a lot of the detail is Liverpool in 1965. And I suppose we ought to say also that the other crucial turning point had been, though this was a couple of years ago, that having read Lovecraft, M.R. James, and the rest, I'd also moved out as a reader, was reading a huge amount in the mainstream. So Graham Greene had become a favourite, and he certainly, showed me stuff to do. And ultimately, Lolita, Nabokov, was the same sort of revelation that Lovecraft had been when I was 14. Nabokov when I was 17, in terms of what you could do with prose and how you could approach, the subject in an extraordinarily oblique fashion. And I suppose that really bears fruit in The Cellars. I think that's the one where I really hit where I'm going and where I've still been going for the rest of my life. Yeah, that's right.
And that's where we're going to stop for the moment. Ramsey, for now.